Hello and welcome to the Self-Reg Show. I am here with my friend and colleague and a woman I admire so much as a human being, a mother, a professor, and so much more. Dr. Sonia Mastrangelo. Welcome, Sonia.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. I really appreciate it.
We have tried to film this 3 or 4 times, everyone. And Sonia and I do this thing where we connect online and we get talking. And, there's a number of different reasons why we're not pressing record. We should probably do that. And this would have come along a lot sooner. Sonia, can you tell everyone just a little bit about you, who you
Sure.
are? Yeah.
I always like to start off with the personal. I'm married. I live in Caledon with my husband and two daughters, Sophie and Charlotte. My husband is Phil. We've been in Caledon for almost 20 years now. We have two beautiful cats, and I'm currently working at Lakehead University. I've been there for about 15 years now. More recently, I've taken on the role of assistant dean, so I'm wearing an administrative hat, but I still dabble in teaching, which is really where my passion is, and doing research quite heavily, and currently serving as the director of research alongside Anne Showalter at the Applied Self-Regulation Knowledge Network.
And you and I were just speaking. We're doing a presentation together this summer. For those of you listening to this when it's first released, July is the 10th annual summer symposium for the Self-Reg Summer Symposium, and Sonia and I are doing a conversation about inclusion, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I bring that up because the first time I ever met you was at the very first
Yes.
Self-Reg Summer Symposium 10 years ago, or almost. And I sat in a presentation with you, and I still remember Stuart telling me, "You've got to go and see Sonia speak," because there were a lot of different presenters that year and every year. And he said, "You got to go and see Sonia speak." And he just told me you went way, way, way back. We may have been on emails or Zoom calls or something together before that, but that was my very first time being in the same room with you. So,
Yeah.
do you remember that talk?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember coming out of that conference, for those of you who are coming to SRSS for the first time, you're in for a treat. It really is one of the best conferences. I so look forward to July. It's a wonderful time of year to host a conference, and it's a chance to get together with self-reggers, but also those who are new to the field and looking at ways to apply it in their context. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about self-reg. I mean, you talk about the medical profession, the social service sector, education. There is wide applicability with all fields when we talk about self-regulation. So it's just a wonderful time.
Yeah, and of being with some of the most amazing humans, like
Mhm.
really like-hearted people, is good
Yes,
for the soul on a beautiful campus at Trent University. So take
absolutely.
me back. How did you meet Stuart?
So my time with Stewart, I'm thinking, goes back about 20 to 25 years. I was a first year PhD student at York University, working with a group of scholars. And Stewart had learned about the work I was doing in a self contained class for students with autism in Mississauga. I was using sign language to help accelerate the expressive and receptive capacities of students on the autism spectrum. So somehow he found me. The Toronto Star had come to do a story on my program. He read the article and came to visit, and popped into the classroom. And after watching me using sign language and cognitive developmental approaches for kids with autism, because I've always been an anti-behaviorist, and
Yeah,
at the time ABA was quite
yeah,
strong, but here we were, this sort of little pocket of developmentalists using a lot of play-based approaches, the Miller method, which is entrenched in cognitive developmental psychology, and Stuart loved it. And so the first thing he did, and I'll never forget, Susan, he approached my principal, Connie Gale, who you know,
yeah,
and said,
yeah.
"Do you think I could borrow Sonia? Because I'm working with Sue in the US with primates, and we're working on using sign language in cages, and I could really use her with some of our apes." And Connie's face just dropped. She said, "What?" She said, "There is no way you're pulling my staff, putting her in a cage." She said, that's just not going to happen. And Stuart, just his response was, well, I thought I'd ask. Like, I wanted to just check in about that because we have a series of experiments going on. And at the time, Stuart was looking at the power of relationships with primates and doing
Yeah.
some incredible work. And so he saw connections to the world of autism and how we were using sign language to communicate.
It is so funny. Like it reminds me of doing a Twitter chat, which we used to do. We don't do those anymore, but these were in the early days, and I'm literally on the phone with Stuart because I would be Stuart's fingers on Twitter. It's always Stuart's ideas, but it was Stuart's fingers, and I'm running the Twitter chat, and I'm doing my own, and it was March 8th, so it was International Day of the Woman, and I said to
Oh,
Stuart, what I think the question was, who is, a woman that has inspired you, or be some kind of a question like that. And someone mentioned Jane Goodall, and he was reading, and he's like, "Oh, Jane," and I'm like, "What do you mean, oh, Jane?" And he's like, "Haven't you seen the picture on my wall at my house? Because that's where we would film for our courses." I'm like, "No." It's like, Jane Good. He's like, "Yeah, she was a science director for something or other that he worked on." It's like, yes, it's just that's sort of how it is with Stuart, sort of these random things that,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yes. So that was my first encounter. And then he found me a year later and was talking to me about the newly formed MEHRIT Centre, the
yeah,
Milton Ethel Harris Research Initiative.
yeah,
Um, he had landed a wonderful grant to start up Dr. Stanley Greenspan's research methodology on play in kids with autism and hired me on as a research assistant interviewing families on the autism diagnostic interview. And so my research at the doctoral level was looking at two programs, ABA and floor time, which is Stanley's model, and family outcomes after families had participated in these two very different interventions. And sure enough, the families that went through the floor time, DIR floor time program, reported stronger connections, the ability to play, sustained focus and attention, overall happiness, strengthening of relationships, which is no surprise given that there's such a focus on that reciprocity.
So there is so much there. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about your research, and to
Mhm.
help people who may not know what DIR is, for example. But I want to just tag on to something. You went back early at the very beginning when you introduced yourself. You said very specifically, "I'm an anti-behaviorist, and I always have been." What do you mean by that? And me too, by the way.
Yeah. I think I've always instinctually felt more comfortable with developmental approaches. I've
Yeah.
never been a fan of, okay, here is a sticker because you did X, Y, and Z. I've never been that type of educator. I began my career at the elementary level in deaf and peel. That system never fit well with me. And the psychology courses that I took in my undergraduate years really helped me to solidify my understanding of what it means to be a developmentalist at heart, looking at the work of Piaget, Vygotsky, Heinz Werner, and appreciating that really it's all about developing relationships. And we are far better saying, I am really proud of you for doing X, Y, and Z, rather than here's your sticker, here's your star, here's your 10 extra minutes on a computer all by yourself where you can go ahead and be further isolated from the group. It just never fit well with me. And when the behaviorists would come in and do this work with kids and with autism, it just didn't feel right, Susan. And when those external rewards were taken away, we were left to deal with kids who were so upset and tantrums. And if I had to equate that to what I've just recently learned in the self regulation resiliency course, and if you
Mhm.
haven't taken that, I encourage you to take it. It's a wonderful 3 months of learning. I would say that behaviorism is a form of maladaptive coping,
Mhm.
no different than resorting to alcohol or, excessive sugar, energy drinks. That's what they were doing with kids with autism. It was find the things that they love. Well, kids with autism were choosing things like Smarties
Yeah.
and jelly beans, and they were getting these hits of sugar but the therapists were pushing specific behaviors and they wanted them to be sitting for certain periods of time so that they could look like the rest of the class, so that they could be a part of the class. And I would push back and question, like, is that true inclusion? Is
Yeah.
that what we mean when we want to define it? And it didn't feel right.
So take us into what a developmentalist, how you would you see this differently? Like what would you do differently? What would that look like? Hearing if relationships matter. I mean, most of us know that, but what does that really mean? What does it look like, sound like, feel like?
That's a great question, Susan. I think for me, it meant really focusing on beginning with reverse integration models. It was opening up that relationship field to all the students in the school. So here we were, a contained class, 8 students on the spectrum, but we wanted to open it up and say, who's interested in coming to spend time in this classroom where you might learn sign language? You're going to learn about opening and closing circles of communication when you're playing on the ground with a couple of kids. And we did have a roster of willing participants. And the most incredible thing happened over time. Yes, we trained them in Miller Method practices, using sign language, getting down on the floor, and following the child's lead,
Mm,
really looking at their interests. So if there was a child who was fixated, as a behaviorist would use that term, on turning a light switch on and off, we would say that's a wonderful moment of inquiry. Let's get that child learning about light switches, possibly electricity, taking lights into dark spaces to see what would happen. Like, the magic was following the child's lead, giving yourself permission to let go of that lesson plan, to say, today I want to truly follow this child and let's see where the learning takes us. And that's what we were able to instill in the students. And over time, what started to happen was quite magical. Friendships started to develop. These
yeah.
kids were then calling the kids on the spectrum on weekends saying, hey, let's go out. Let's get to the park. Let's go to a party. The friendships became sustained over time, well outside the context of that classroom. So that's what we're after, the magic of forming relationships. I think the other thing Stuart taught me is break down the boundaries. Try not to follow school board policy, like parents can't come into the room, they need to sign in at the office. And fortunately, I had a principal who was on board, and
Yeah.
she said, "Sure, you want to have families in?" She said, "Well, can we say Fridays?" And I said, "Well, let's try to go with their schedules. They might be working."
Yeah, yeah.
So Stuart was a big believer, like, bring families in to share their talents. If you have a parent who's a chef, get that person to come in and do a whole cooking lesson rather than teaching kids about cooking as a discrete skill by following a step-by-step recipe that's contrived. He said, you want to make it as naturalistic as possible. And rather than learning about these concepts through texts and stories, bring that three-dimensional person into your space. And the best people to do it are the families, because they have students in that classroom, they're forming connections, and they're also developing relationships with the other students in the class.
I love that. It's sort of when it reminds me of when people talk about engagement, parent engagement, right? Oh, we
Mhm.
can't get any parent volunteers out. One place I was working with them, and they were trying to get the parents more involved. And it's like,
Mhm.
well, we keep calling for volunteers, but it was volunteers to do the snack program at 9 to 7 or 8 to 9 every day. And here is exactly what you're going to feed. We don't really, it's a total flip on things. It's saying, hey,
Mhm.
and then we're saying they won't come into the school, even just that language is they, right? We're
Yes.
othering people immediately, right? I love, I'm a big disruptor too. I try to work within the boundaries, but
Yeah.
but I also advocate like crazy for things that need to be changed. And sometimes we need to think about the fact that what we think is a boundary is not actually a boundary. Nobody
Yes.
has said the parents can't come into a school. It might be the way
Mhm.
it is. And then unpack that and say why. Oh, well, we're worried about gossip, or we're worried about the child's, there's going to be, I want to ask you about meltdowns. There's going to be a meltdown in front of the parents or whatever, or we just don't do that. Well, saying, why? Right?
Mhm.
And the more that we bring the parents in, the more that of those genuine relationships we're building. But it's also communicating to the child, hey, your family matters to me. They're welcome
Absolutely.
here.
Yes.
And, did you
Yes.
have a lot of behavior problems? So I'm just imagining somebody listening to this saying, "Oh, that sounds great. Let Sonia, let Dr. Mastrangelo come on into my place, and there's no way I could do that because there'll be absolute chaos."
Mhm.
What would you say to someone like that?
I
And
think
by the way, those people care. We've got to be
yes.
careful not to write anybody off. They care.
Yes.
They just
Yes.
don't see a way to do it because it sounds like you're saying, "Oh, just everything's sort of light and airy and free, and we're all singing kumbaya." Do you know what I mean? It has that sort of feeling, but you are that warm. You are a relationship person. My daughter talks about you like that. Like she says, Sonia makes you feel like you've known her your whole life. So you're like that with everyone, Sonia.
Thanks for that,
But
Susan.
you're also, well, you're also thinking of that development. Like we don't want to lose that word
Yeah.
development, right? It's
Yeah.
the well-being and development and sort of the awe and the honor of being with these children,
Mhm. Mhm.
and seeing where what's possible and where it's going to lead us. So how would you respond to somebody that is absolutely convinced they don't think they could do that approach?
Mhm. I think I always begin with behavior because it's such a big word, Susan, and it has such negative connotations. And in working with behaviorists historically, I've often heard the word we need to extinguish.
Yeah,
And my pushback in a gentle way has always been, but why? Right? And Stuart has taught us that. Why?
yeah,
Why are we doing this and why now? Why can't we honor those tears as cortisol cleansers? Or maybe for that child, it means screaming and letting out that cortisol in different ways, feeling that anger. Why are we trying to bottle up emotions when we experience the gamut of emotions? I mean, I just had my grandmother's funeral mass a few days ago and I was crying. And, I turned around and a few people were holding it together. But I'm at that stage in my life.
yeah,
If the tears feel like coming, that's okay. That's actually a great thing. It's your body's way of expelling that stress. And so it never sat with me that we were trying to bottle these kids up. Like, you need to be like everyone else. You need to sit like everyone else. You need to behave like everyone else. Well, that's not what we want. This child is neurodiverse. And I always say they are differently abled, right?
yeah,
Even the word disabled, I have a hard time with. So for us, yes, tantrums would sometimes happen, meltdowns, whatever the case may be. And the first thing I often do, Susan, is the lights go off and
yeah,
everyone sort of slows down their movements in the classroom. Sometimes I might turn on some classical music if it feels right. I often had lavender nearby, and I would always give that child room and permission, give them the space to feel their feelings in that moment. So if that meant crying, they're not harming anyone. If it meant stomping on the floor, that was fine as well. We had a child that would often throw things. Eventually, we got him throwing things in a bucket. So he knew when he was upset, he could throw things, but they had to be in a designated bucket.
yeah,
Eventually it went from throwing the squishy balls in the bucket to just squishing them and having them in his pocket. It changed over time as he matured and developed and understood his own body and feeling that frustration. Because for them, when the communication is not there, they can't say, like, I'm having a crappy day today, so please pardon me. They don't have the language to share that. So we really have to be detectives, as Stuart says, bring on that stress hat and try to figure out in those 5 domains what's going on. So once the tantrum is happening, when I feel the time is right, I may sit beside that child. And if they allow me to pat them on the back and just use a soft, soothing voice, like, I'm sorry you're really upset, I might repeat something that's happened, but I might sometimes just stay in their presence and just be. And I know that's so hard, right? Just be in that moment. It reminds me, I'm currently taking an acting class with Second City on Saturdays.
neat.
And in the last few weeks, like, they're training us to just slow down and be in a role. Don't feel scurried to get the words out. Like, slow it down, because we don't normally speak that way. And, kids can sense our energy. We talk about that Thayer matrix. They know, I truly believe they know where we are along those four quadrants. So, as much as possible, like just remaining calm and saying, yeah, this child's having, a rotten day, which sometimes causes me to have a rotten day, right? Those mirror neurons are powerful, that co regulation. But as Stuart has so beautifully reminded us, being an educator is about the intrapersonal, it's the relationship between teacher and child, teacher and class, and
Mhm.
then teacher and other teachers. Like, there's so many dynamics at play, and it can get tricky navigating all of that.
Neat. Has so as I know you're still working with because you travel overseas, right? And work
Yes.
with the Miller method. And I know there's some self-reg embedded in there, but you're working
Yes.
with autistic communities in all
Yes.
kinds of different places. Is that right?
Yes. I've
Can you
Yeah, I've had the privilege. Some work in the Philippines, South Korea. Most of my work has been in the Kingdom of Bahrain. The
yeah.
princess of the country has a son on the spectrum and opened a school 15 years ago. And they've been using the Miller method there for years. And they invite me back every year to work with both students and staff and parents, all three, just revitalizing some of their approaches, bringing in some new ideas. So most of my work has been there, but I've also done some work in Texas. There's a Miller clinic there. Um, Most recently in Brazil, just before the pandemic, brought some of my Miller work there. So it's sort of been in different pockets of the world.
So you're talking about the Miller method, but I'm also hearing a lot of self-reg.
Absolutely.
Am I right about that? Like I'm
Yeah.
hearing reframing
Yeah.
behavior. I'm hearing recognizing and reducing stressors and helping with that stress awareness. And I haven't heard specifically restoration. Well,
Yes.
restoration of relationships, I guess, is a piece of it. But am I right that I'm hearing a lot? I don't know the Miller method well, except for the little bit I know through you.
Just
Are there
before
a lot of
Dr. Miller, yeah, just before he passed, Susan, he wrote a wonderful book that was more practitioner based, because his first book was highly theoretical. And he said, before I pass, I would love for Stuart to read the book and to offer.
really?
So Stuart so kindly did that. He
Yeah.
devoted his time to read the text and wrote a review. And he called me and he said, this work, this Miller method work, aligns so beautifully to
Mhm.
self-regulation and empathy, because Stuart was doing a lot of work on empathy in those early days and had just met Stanley Greenspan.
Right.
So
So a
doc-
couple decades ago.
yeah, so
Yeah.
Dr. Miller would refer sort of the higher functioning students to Stanley Greenspan. And Stanley, when students were nonverbal,
Yeah.
what we would call still developing systems and units of behavior, like dynamic systems theory comes in here, would send them to Dr. Miller. So they had this beautiful relationship, consulting with one another. And because Stuart had started to do work with Stanley and I was working with Dr. Miller, it sort of all came together.
Neat. So now
Yeah.
you've told us about, well, obviously it comes to the current day, but you've told us about your past and as an educator and your PhD and all of this work that you've been sharing. What about now as a professor? Where does self-reg come in? I mean, you're part of well, the lead, I guess, in a way, or the
Mhm.
co-lead on the Applied Self-Reg Knowledge Network. But what does that mean? And like, what does it look like at your institution? Where's
Mhm.
the relevance?
Well, I'm going to quote you, Susan. Soft eyes in
Yeah.
all I do. And in every moment, whether I'm acting chair of the department, assistant dean, or I'm in a classroom giving a lecture, when a student now approaches me and they're in crisis or they can't get an assignment in, your words actually come to me.
Huh.
And I think, okay, what would Susan say right now? The soft eyes,
Yeah.
stop, really listen. And not just listen through those facial expressions, but it's the body language. What is this individual telling me right now? It's a tough time in their lives. This assignment worth 20%. is really sort of low on that scheme of what they need to accomplish. And right now, they need my help and support in whichever way I can give it. So, your words have been extremely impactful and profound for me at the university level. If you haven't taken the foundations courses, it's a wonderful place to begin. And reading Stuart's texts and Susan's Calm, Alert, and Learning. I mean, we're going way back to, I think, 2012. But really, the work has been informed by the literature that's been published by the MEHRIT Centre, the courses that you offer, and the yearly self-reg course or conference, excuse me. Having those three has been pivotal because I think it has allowed me to give myself permission to fail, give
Mhm.
myself permission to, have the soft eyes for others and myself, because there will be times when, I'm just not feeling it. It's one of those weeks, or something might be going on at home with the girls, whatever the case may be. It has been instrumental. And I tell everyone it's what got me through the pandemic, because that
Yeah,
was a really tough time for me on a personal level.
yeah,
So it affects the way I design a course, it affects the group work that I plan, it affects the way I deliver content, making sure that it's understandable for everyone. I don't always succeed, but I know I try. Like I try as hard as I can to reach as many as I can. And really trying to establish connections and relationships with students to say, what interests you? I could give you a list like I want everyone to write a paper on self-reg. No, I mean, I would love that, but I don't do that. I'll say, you've learned about self regulation. How can you apply it to an area of research or an area of study that you're interested in? And so a student might produce a paper on how self regulation could assist with depression, or someone else might write a paper on how self regulation could assist with their dieting, the yo yo dieting that they've gone through. Like there are so many areas and connections, and self regulation is a universal language. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. It really, once you invest the time in learning it, it just becomes a part of you. You can't separate it from how you think, how you feel, and what you do.
and if you're new to self-reg, when you hear Sonia talking about self-regulation, know that there are over 447 um,
Mhm.
definitions of it out there. So sometimes we may hear it and we think self-control. This is really the that original brain body understanding of how we manage stress and how we recover from it. But again, if you're hearing that, you think you know what it means, dive a little deeper, because I'm like you, Sonia. I think that self-reg helped me through the pandemic and
Mhm.
through lots. I've been gone through a hard thing this year,
Mhm.
and it doesn't make it perfect. It's not that you have all the answers, but when you understand a little bit of that science of what's going on in your brain and body, why you're feeling that way, why you just got judgy or lost your patience or whatever the thing that you weren't going to do and why you did it, and you begin to see it a little bit differently, it I don't know, it lightens the guilt that many
Mhm.
of us carry, it and allows you to focus on the right things. You realize that you're completely depleted, you focus
Yes,
on that, right?
yes,
So
absolutely.
I want to ask you something, because when we were talking about the Applied Self-Reg Knowledge Network, which is we have one, TMC has one staff member on that, Dr.
Mhm.
And Showalter, and then our partner, which is Sonia, but she's not staff; she's with the university. And there's a number of people that are on there: Marie Edwards, Jerry Costa. There's a number of fabulous people. But I remember hearing about you, Sonia, that and you told me you credited this with self-reg. Someone described you as the person that could get things out of an interview in a research situation. You
Mhm.
would get people would answer and they would just tell you, all of these really, really deep and meaningful things when you were doing as part of research with, all the ethics applied and so on. And you said
Mhm.
something kind of magical. You said it's because of self-reg. Tell me what that means, because I think not everybody is going to be a researcher working with partners, but the lessons, the way that you applied that, I think are actually helpful in a whole bunch of different contexts.
Mhm. I think I often hear fellow researchers say, "Oh, I have to do the dreaded interviews for my study." And hearing that time and time again, I thought, what is it about interviews? Why don't people like conducting them, crafting the questions, delivering them? Is it just they find it disengaging? And when I probed a little further, colleagues would say, like, it's just so difficult to get them talking. It's so difficult to get a participant to really divulge and give the answers you're looking for. And my response was, perhaps go in not expecting anything,
Mm,
right? Because we go into situations with our own backpacks, our own expectations of what it should be. But there's a freedom that self reg gives you in letting go of all these predetermined things that sort of fly around in our minds. And just as I mentioned earlier, being in the moment, right?
mm,
And self reg gave me permission to say, these are my questions. I have ethics approval, but I will include in my research ethics application so that the board knows I will deviate and I will follow the participants' lead so that
mhm.
they're comfortable. And I can always go back to my original question, but I think people are much more comfortable sharing their narratives, sharing what they want to share and when they feel ready to share it. And unless we create that sense of safety, which is what self reg gifts us with, is making people feel safe through what
Mhm.
you're doing right now, Susan. You're nodding, you're smiling, you're acknowledging the intonation of your voice. All of those things are making this interview feel less stressful. I feel at peace. I feel I could share anything with you,
Neat.
even though it's being recorded. But
Yeah.
it's that gift that you're giving me through the acknowledgement, the nods, the smiles, and those subtle cues or those nonverbal ways of communicating are so important. And Stuart talks about those in his courses as well. And
And, you know yeah.
sorry, I was going to
Oh, go
say
ahead.
for me, something you said to me this week was the focus on the environment. And you
Yeah.
said that to me on Wednesday. We were talking about self regulation. That hasn't left me for a few days. And I thought about all the ways that self reg really works when we have an environment that feels safe, right?
Yeah.
It's crucial. And you're creating safety right now in this platform.
Well, that's neat, and it makes me think of when Stuart talks about mindfulness, it's not the Eastern idea of mindfulness, although for some people it could be, and that could fit if if that's your thing, that
Mhm.
it definitely could fit. But it's more that being in the moment. And I think the one thing, I thank you for the nice words that you're saying. One thing that I am doing is like I'm actually listening. I have no idea where this was going to go. We went on we had a few questions, but there's been a bit of a river here. I mean, this is different than a research interview, but it's that genuine listening. And sometimes it's when we're having a hard time, like got this scripted things that we're supposed to do. Okay, nod your head, and you're trying to nod your head versus it's just being like really deeply curious. You talked about the inquiry with one of your students in the past. It's that same sort of idea, like really trying to hear the other person. But that also, the science of the interbrain, there would be
Mhm.
synchrony happening between us,
Yeah.
when you have that sort of back and flow. Like we all know what it feels like when the Zoom is, or whatever video we're on is sort of broken, and it shortens things, makes things feel choppy. Like I would think all of those things would be part of it as well. Anyway, that's a really interesting thing, Sonia. And I do think my 16-year-old daughter was pretty wise about, you have a gift. You talked about safety, um, and as the base, as the foundation, and it is. If we're not safe, if we don't feel safe in
Mhm.
every sense of the word. But she said that you
Mhm.
had this way of making people feel like you'd known them forever. Right?
Oh,
And I think there's something about that, there's something lovely in you. And I think it's something for others of us to think about when we're trying to think about how to co-regulate, how to help someone with their energy and tension, and how to lend that calm. That's not everybody go to
mhm.
sleep or have a rest or whatever, but I'm not trying to change a
Yes.
behavior or get compliance. I'm just trying to, be that person next to someone. How do I
Yes.
make them feel felt like that's Dan Siegel's language? I really like that, and that feel felt, and feel that kind of
Mm.
level of comfort. So you're
Abs
very, your students speak highly of you. I know you're funny because you keep turning the compliments back, but I'm going to throw them back to you. When I did one of your conferences, the Ask conference, I've been to a couple conferences at your university that you organized and ran, and your students go on and on and on about you. And one of the things I heard was that Sonia is always there for me. You know, like, no matter what, I can, the Dr. Mastrangelo, they didn't call you Sonia, but that she kind of understands, and she's always there. And yet you have some of your students. So some people might hear that and think that you're just helping out in a whole bunch of different ways, which I'm sure you're doing. But many of these students went like, we're getting master's degrees, they're winning awards in their areas, you know like they're doing really well academically, and yet they're having a lot of challenges, right? Like, I know that one of your things that you've
Mhm.
been advocating for recently is support for university students in mental health, right? So
Yeah.
it's the gamut of people. It's the people that kind of disappear quietly, but it's also the overachievers that might look like they're doing just fine. But you can recognize there's more going on. I don't know. Sorry, I'm all over the place. But is there something you want to speak to about that, Sonia? That connection to how the students, how you're doing with the post secondary students, or your concern or your advocacy around
Mhm.
mental health in particular?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Susan. I think it always begins with recognizing, that there's something going on in the environment. So we started to realize that our mental health counselors at the university were bogged down with referrals, long wait lists. And, it really caused this pause like, why is this happening? Why now? So it's going back to what you and Stuart often share, hit that pause button and say, okay, wait a minute, this is more than we have ever seen before in this post pandemic period. We've returned face to face. People aren't wearing masks and life seems to be back to normal, but yet we've got this long list of students waiting for services, students reporting high levels of anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide. The list goes on and on. Students involved in substance abuse. And so, in speaking to the team at Ask, I thought, we need to look at a research grant to bring self regulation, Shanker self reg, into the world of academia for university students. And I don't want to stop there, Susan, because I think all professors, that would be
Mm,
my next step. Because once the students are aware of self reg, we need to start working with faculty and staff. It really does take a village. You and I often talk about school communities. Like, if we're only looking at one group, parents, we're missing teachers, we're missing students. It needs to be sort of this triangular approach where you're hitting all three so that everyone is sort of working from the same perspective. It doesn't mean the self reg journey is going to look the same, but there's a common foundational understanding. And as you mentioned, there are so many definitions. And we
mhm,
just need to make sure that self reg isn't interpreted as a self control, like a self regulated learning program. And I have
mhm,
books on my shelf about that. They are so different from the brain body connection that Stuart and you talk about. So it's really trying to tease apart, the different programs that are out there and understanding that this is truly a way of being. It's a way of understanding, and it never leaves you. Those important questions that we are often encouraged to think about in self reg. Why is this happening? Why now? Which domains are being impacted? Which
mhm,
ones can I have an effect on? Am I actually approaching this situation? Am I being open? Am I being collaborative? What's my tone like? Have I done everything I can to really support this student? Have I been able to bypass the system in some ways to help this student along their journey? Sometimes it does mean pushing back against those institutional policies to say, hold on a minute, they don't apply here because of this student's context or their family circumstance. So self reg has really taught me to look beyond what we see with the naked eye and to really try to peel those layers and to do that deep digging that sometimes takes time, right?
mhm,
Self reg reminds me that, like, this isn't a quick, like, oh, I got the answer, I'm going to tackle this on Monday, by Tuesday it'll be fixed, by Wednesday. It's
Yeah.
not like that. It's organic. It takes time. I'm working in a community now. We've been working through a self-reg project for 3 years. I mean, some wonderful moments have happened, but the journey continues. There's
Mhm.
never a time where you say, well, that was that self-reg project. It's over. It doesn't
Mhm.
work that way. Self-reg is about really internally reflecting and making that an ongoing part of our lives.
I can't agree more. I love that, first of all. Tell us about the course. There's a mini course. I mean, it's for post-secondary students, but it would be relevant for any young adults, really. A post-secondary course with you and Stuart that was on self-reg that will be available next September. What
Yes.
would you like people to know about that?
Yeah. Well, I first want people to know that we're going to launch it at SRSS. So the Self Reg Symposium, Dr. Ann Showalter and I will talk a little bit about the modules, and we're hoping to pilot it on a small group. There are 4 modules that have been created, really tackling issues such as working through the stresses of university life, coursework, conducting a thesis, navigating the relationship with a supervisor, working through complex assignments, working in groups. I mean, I gave a university lecture last year and asked students to get into groups, and I had a select few approach me and said, Dr. M, we don't know how to work in groups. We've been online for the last 3 years. And these are young adults. Susan, they're 20, 21. And so that was one of those aha moments like, whoa, I need to take a step back. I'm taking for granted the fact that I expect people in their early 20s to be able to work in groups of 3 and 4, but these students never had that experience. So it's navigating all of those issues. And um, I've also had students in the last couple of years say, we cannot give presentations. We have social anxiety. We're not accustomed to speaking in front of a group in person. We can do it online, but we don't know how to make the leap to the 3 dimensional world. These are real problems they're facing. And many of them are struggling in the classroom when they're going out to do their practice teaching. They can
Mm.
understand educational theory, but once they get to placement and they need to work with kids in the moment, they're really falling apart. They feel dysregulated. And
Right.
so that's when we hope for a wonderful co regulator, a wonderful mentor teacher who's in the classroom, who lets that teacher candidate take risks and fall. And that's okay. And get back up. And how can I support you? Because at the end of the day, life is about making mistakes, right? And learning from them. That's all we can ask for.
And if
Yeah.
you're curious about this course, like a self-rate course is no, you're not going to come and get a list of 10 things to do, of more advice on the things, a whole bunch of, it's not to say that there can't be strategies. Strategies for sure can help, but it's really looking at that under what's underneath it, trying to figure out the why and why now. And it, for many of us, that's like Sonia said in the beginning, once you begin to see it, you'll see differently and you'll feel differently, but it also helps you find the path out. So it's just a mini course, but it is a chance to learn a little bit of the science from Stuart himself and Stuart and Sonia, and apply it in your own life. So we're really excited about that. How would people reach you, Sonia? So you mentioned the pilot. I said it was going to launch. It is launching in September, but there's also a pilot, and there's an opportunity. For people to be part of the pilot. How would people reach you? Obviously, they can find the course on TMC, so we're
Yeah.
building it, so they
Yeah.
can find it on. We'll make sure to link it into the podcast. So if you don't see it linked in here yet, it just means the link won't be available until just before symposium, so in July. But it's
Absolutely.
close, and so you can learn
Yes.
more there. But how could people reach you if they wanted to find out more about anything that you've talked to us about today, Sonia?
Email would probably be best, and maybe we can flash my email at the end.
Sure.
That's the best way to reach me. I also want to give kudos to Susan and Arlene Robinson, who helped build the course. With any great course, there's video, but then it's the follow up questions and the thinking and the reflection. And that's where the real magic happens because we sit, we watch something, and then it's, okay.
Yeah.
this is making sense. And yeah, this reminds me of a time when, or I've got this coming. How does this influence my next move in this meeting or in this lecture hall? So that's the important piece I want people to really focus on is those the content questions, the applicability questions. And that's what really synthesizes, that's what sets apart all the courses for the Merit Center. It is really the most dynamic way to learn. And I've taken a lot of online courses, but there's never a dull moment when I take a course with the Merit Center because the magic works. You've got two wonderful people speaking about topics. There's this beautiful dance that happens of reciprocity. Wonderful concepts are raised. And Stuart will often talk about the science. And then you, Susan, have a way of digesting that science and making it applicable to the field of education, psychology, social work. And you always bring the stories in and the examples, and those never leave us. We never forget the stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I'll tell everyone don't bombard Sonia with questions about about the course. You can send those to TMC at info@self-reg.ca. When I mentioned Sonia's email, it was more of you're a professor, you have a group of students that you would like to take this, or maybe you're interested in applied self-reg research, or there's
Yes.
some kind of a connection, those sorts of things. So we can certainly redirect to Sonia if it's a question that is over our heads. We'd be happy to do that for you as well. Well, it's a final word, Sonia, and the only thing that I didn't really get to ask you about, and I don't know if there's anything you would like to say more than you've already said. But I'm just curious. So, self-reg has affected you professionally. Clearly, it's been your journey,
Mhm.
but it's also personally as well. And we're both moms and busy
Yes.
women, and we talk often about these sorts of things. You said self-reg got you through some hard times. Is there anything you want to tell us about as we finish up for the end of our podcast here today about self-reg personally and how it's influenced your life?
Well, I know there isn't a self-reg course right now on self-regulation and marriages, but I think there should be because I think of all the ways it's strengthened my marriage. And the one example I give, it's a talk I gave a few years ago on my husband, and Phil will give me full permission to share this. I speak in the past tense, had a flying phobia. And someone might say, well, how? I mean, that's not really a big deal. But it was in the early years when we were traveling and it was so difficult for Phil, or we would pick Florida where we could drive. And it wasn't until I really immersed myself in the self reg courses that I thought, now I truly understand what fear is. Like
Mhm.
Stuart talked about the visceral response and how, we go into this state of we just shut down. And I was tackling Phil's fear of flying on a cognitive level. He had taken courses, strategies, and none of that worked. But it wasn't
Yeah.
until I started talking to him about self reg and feeling calm, feeling safe, feeling grounded, that was the key. Phil flies everywhere now, by the way, full disclosure. But it meant holding his hand during the flight, doing some joint deep breathing with him, distracting him, talking to him about topics of interest. And before you
Yeah.
know it, a 3-hour flight, to the Caribbean is over. All of those pieces that Stuart reminds us of around relationship building and feeling safe, as long as he felt safe. And I knew he could get that through co regulation. And so here's an idea, Susan: marriages and self reg, because I'm telling you, you'd put like marriage therapists and counselors out of business. But truthfully, it has changed my relationship with Phil and as a mom with the girls. Soft eyes follows me wherever I go. I try. I mean, we certainly have our challenges as a family, especially in this post pandemic period with both the girls still feeling the residuals, and anxiety plagues us. But I'll give an example. I was recently sharing with Susan some of the challenges my daughter's going through. And Susan looked at me and said, go with what she's interested in. Always like think
Yeah.
about, really sit and try to capitalize on her passions, what she feels strongly about, and start from there. And, have her feel that sense of purpose in her community. And it's working. So I'll
Mm,
just say, open yourself up to self regulation. Give yourself the chance to sort of let go of, preconceived notions of following that path of just a program, or, I must do this in units, I must teach it. Stepping outside of that, come on, pull up your socks, and where's your grit? Where is your self
yeah.
control? Letting go of all of that and just being in the moment and appreciating it for what it is, and also accepting the fact that there will be failure along the way. I think as a society, there's still this pressure. It's got to, you've got to get every grant. You've got to, no, it's okay. We try, but we will have setbacks in life. And resiliency, self-reg, it teaches us to sort of reflect. It allows us to be open to the possibility of change, and also recognizing that sometimes there are things I can't change.
Yeah.
Like some things won't change, and that's okay too. Like I find if I could say it in one way, for me, self reg has meant healing in both the professional and personal worlds.
I love that, and I love knowing there's science behind it all too, you know? That's just such
Absolutely.
a lovely way to end our conversation today, Sonia. Thank you so much for taking some time to join the Self-Reg show. I look forward to seeing you in person at the symposium and doing our talk on inclusion together. And
Yes.
yeah,
And Susan, thank you for all you do. You embody self reg in everything you do and say. So thank you for the gift of your friendship.
you're very generous to me. Thank you, Sonia.